Welcome to the record that was never finished. March 12, 1864. The colored regiment was sent east of the river. No orders were returned. Reports of gunfire at dusk. At dawn, silence. Fate unknown. Field log, Union Command, Georgia District. Another line from the same folder reads, 10 bodies recovered, none identified, drums missing. The file ends there. No signature, no continuation. Only a gap in the record, a pause long enough to swallow an entire company. Decades later in the 1930s, a woman interviewed for the WPA Slave Narratives in Liberty County said, "They said freedom came with drums, but next morning the drums didn't speak, only the wind was left." Her interviewer marked it folklore. No name of the regiment appears, no cross-reference to any battle, only a note in pencil, possibly local superstition. But the burial logs from Savannah list 17 graves dated March 14th, all marked unknown. The handwriting matches the officer who wrote fate unknown. Somewhere between those two lines, the fact and the voice is where history went quiet. There are no surviving photographs, no confirmed roster, only traces of scorched drum skin found in 1908, a torn Union patch preserved in a church chest, one hymn recorded by the Library of Congress in 1936 titled, "Where the Guns Lay Still." The archivist who cataloged it added a marginal note. This melody bears no known origin but is remembered only by descendants in McIntosh County. Its rhythm resembles a march slowed down, as if walking with the dead. No official record calls it a massacre. No memorial was built. No historian can say whether the unit deserted, disappeared, or was erased. What remains are fragments and the silence between them. Before we begin, leave the comment where you're watching from and the exact time you paused. What did you feel in that silence? The primary surviving documentation related to the disappearance of the so-called colored regiment east of the river is contained within a series of field reports and correspondence held in the National Archives Record Group, 94 records of the Adjutant General's Office, 1780 to 1917 subseries, Georgia District Military Dispatches, March 1864. The entry bearing the phrase "Fate Unknown" originates from a field notebook attributed to Captain L.M. Hensley, 2nd Division, U.S. Colored Troops, dated March 12 to 14, 1864, near Darien, Georgia. The document, preserved on browned paper with partial water damage, was first cataloged by archivist Edgar R. Wills in 1919 under the provisional label "Unverified Combat Note Coastal Expedition Colored." The handwriting in the log matches that of several letters written by Hensley to his superior, Major S.J. Croft, during the same campaign. One of these letters, dated March 10th, refers to a detachment ordered toward the lower crossings of the Altamaha for supply retrieval and field assessment. No return dispatch is recorded after March 11th. Croft's summary memorandum on March 17th simply states no word from Hensley's men, assumed taken prisoner or lost to terrain. The second set of records comes from the Quartermaster Burial Register of Savannah Entry Enos 404-1, 405-7. All 17 burials are dated March 14, 1864. Cause of death is left blank. The column labeled Regiment Company reads unknown. The handwriting is later confirmed by forensic paleographer Mary O. Delaney. Savannah Historical Bureau, 1978, is identical to that in Hensley's field notebook. This overlap was noted but not formally explained in Delaney's 1981 paper, Annotations of Absence Lost Records of the Coastal Colored Units. A cross-reference search within the Freedmen's Bureau Communications Georgia Division, 1865 to 1870, yields one letter from a chaplain, Reverend Silas E. Boyd, written a year later, recalling a regiment of colored men whose traces ended at the swamp road beyond Darien. Boyd's wording suggests local awareness of the loss but offers no corroboration. In 1936, the Federal Writers Project WPA conducted interviews in Liberty and McIntosh counties, Georgia, as part of the Slave Narrative collection. Among the transcriptions is one by field worker Miss Lila Gray, catalogued as Georgia Narrative number 72B. The respondent, identified only as Old M. Freedwoman, age about 92, recounted a story of men marching with drums after the guns done stopped, adding, "They said they walk east that night and never come back, but folks heard the beat down in the ground when rain come." The official WPA classification for this statement reads, "Folklore, local legend connected to Civil War troop movement, unverified." No follow-up interview is listed. However, a margin note in pencil appears on the typescript copy. Field worker did not return next season. According to administrative correspondence held at the Library of Congress Federal Writers Project Archives, Box 34, Georgia, Liberty County. Miss Lila Gray's last recorded assignment was dated August 17, 1938. She was scheduled to travel again along the Darien Road to collect additional testimony from the same district. She never submitted further material. An internal memo from Project Supervisor Ruth R. Donnelly dated October 3, 1938 reads, "No word from Miss Gray since her last dispatch from Riceboro. Supplies and typewriter case unreturned. Local sheriff unable to locate. No death certificate or resignation was filed. Her personnel card is stamped closed unaccounted." Thus, the surviving body of evidence consists of 4 strands: the 1864 field notebook and letters of Captain Hensley, the Savannah burial register bearing matching handwriting, the 1865 clerical note from Reverend Boyd, the 1936 oral testimony recorded by Miss Gray, whose disappearance 2 years later remains unexplained. All 4 documents converge geographically within a radius of 20 miles, centered on the Altamaha River corridor, a region marked in contemporary survey maps as low marshland and pine barrens. The terrain's composition, tidal creeks, quicksand pockets, and periodic flooding could account for troop loss. Yet the persistence of local oral narratives introduces a separate line of inquiry. In the 1941 Savannah State College Folklore Symposium, researcher Dr. Henry B. Claxton cited the Gray testimony as an example of syncretic memory, the merging of recorded military silence with surviving spiritual rhythms. He noted that the chant, "Where the Guns Lay Still," carried a cadence identical to documented march songs of the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops. Claxton proposed that the legend's endurance may reflect suppressed historical trauma rather than invention. His paper, while cautious, was dismissed by the Georgia Historical Review as speculative without primary field corroboration. Subsequent academic references between 1950 and 1980 treat the event inconsistently alternately as a possible routing error battlefield myth or disappearance legend. The lack of military correspondence beyond March 14th continues to hinder verification. Archival evaluation conducted in 1994 by the U.S. Army Center of Military History Case File, CMH 11864-21A, concluded that no official record exists under Hensley's command beyond the date indicated. Absence of casualty reporting renders classification impossible. Nevertheless, one attachment within that report includes a facsimile of a partially burned muster sheet discovered in a church attic in 1989 by volunteer historian Thomas A. Ridley. 2 visible surnames correspond to soldiers listed in the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops Company D, Private Amos Clay and CPL Gideon Turney. Both are recorded as missing after engagement near Darien. Ridley's private notes, Georgia Historical Repository, Folder 12, Field Recollections 1988 to 1992, mention a local informant, an elderly man identified as Isaac Miles, who claimed that people heard marching in the fog even years after the war. His comment is followed by Ridley's own notation in parentheses folklore, unverified but matches WPA account. From a historiographical standpoint, the case illustrates the intersection between factual void and cultural retention. The persistence of a rhythm, whether documented as a hymn or described as subterranean drumming, serves as an echo of the absence itself. The archival trail is sparse but self-reinforcing. Each fragment cites another fragment, and each witness vanishes into the same geography that erased the first. Among the researchers who attempted to reconcile these records, none could establish the final location of Hensley's detachment. The official records of the War of the Rebellion series of Volume 35 contain no reference to his unit's fate. The field ledger from which the first quote was drawn, "Fate Unknown," remains the last verified line under his name. In total, 6 individuals connected to the documentation process. Hensley disappeared 1864, Croft died 1865, Boyd died 1866, Wills archivist 1919, cause of death. Unlisted Claxton researcher 1943, presumed drowned near Altamaha, and Lila Gray field worker 1938, unaccounted form an incidental chain of loss surrounding the same set of records. No institutional link connects their deaths beyond coincidence of geography. Still, the recurrence is statistically improbable and frequently cited by local historians as an example of archival convergence. Whether such correlation implies pattern superstition or the attrition of work in hazardous terrain remains unproven. What endures in verifiable form are signatures, margins, and missing pages. The combination of military absence and folkloric persistence continues to attract study from historians of race, memory, and sound. Each attempt to reconstruct the event returns to the same sentence written in fading ink in 1864, "At dawn silence. Fate unknown." And on the reverse side of the final page, faintly legible under ultraviolet inspection, one later note appears, handwriting unidentified, date uncertain. The field worker who recorded this testimony vanished 2 years later on the same road. The first written trace of the vanished regiment does not appear in any official military log, but in the classifieds of the Savannah Republican, April 4, 1864. The small advertisement buried between plantation auctions and supply lists offers $10 for the return of 3 colored men last seen near the burned wagons east of Darien, believed deserters or fugitive contrabands. The wording is cautious, the tone indifferent. It was signed by Lieutenant J. Norvell, acting quartermaster, 2nd Division Colored Troops. 1 week later, a short correction appears. Reports of disappearance unsubstantiated. No follow-up, no record of payment. The ad is later found decades after the war, reused as wrapping for musket cartridges in a depot archive. The accidental survival of that notice begins the first factual thread. Its edges are blackened by powder smoke, but the text remains legible enough to confirm the earliest mention of missing men east of the river. The quartermaster clerk who filed it, a man named Silas Trent, left no further annotation. His ledger number ends abruptly. The same month, Union headquarters in Savannah recorded an inventory loss, colored regiment detachment presumed off course. The phrase off course reappears in multiple communications, yet never clarifies whether the troops were lost to terrain or command. A second reference surfaces in the Freedmen's Bureau correspondence, June 6, 1864. Agent P.L. Gaines, Savannah Subdistrict, reports that relatives of men enlisted from Liberty County have made repeated inquiry, none returned. Gaines writes that the women say they hear the drums in the ground when the rain falls. He appends the note, possibly local delusion. His supervisor underlines it twice. That Bureau report becomes the earliest instance where written record intersects with oral belief, the sound of drums replacing the sound of guns. By 1871, the name of the place, the marsh road east of Darien, appears in a different context, the Bryan County Courthouse. The petition of former soldier Ephraim Carter requests pay for 4 men presumed lost, March 1864. In the transcript, Carter testifies, "We heard no sound after the guns, only the hush the marsh took them." The clerk writes in the margin, "Subject speaks of hearing drums, unfit testimony." The court dismisses the claim for lack of evidence. No one investigates further. The docket remains folded untouched in the courthouse archive. In 1889, the Colored American Tribune prints an unsigned column recalling the night when the drums stopped. The writer, identified only as an old campaigner, claims to have seen the men enter the flooded woods and never return. He writes, "The river moved, but it wasn't the river, it was the ground breathing." The editor adds a single bracketed comment, possibly drunken fantasy. The article closes with an unrelated advertisement for sewing machines. Even here the story is interrupted, framed by commerce and disbelief. Each of these fragments exists independently: the advertisement, the bureau report, the court petition, the newspaper recollection. None confirm the others. But their language, silence, disappearance, drums, aligns with uncanny precision. The evidence reads like a pattern carved beneath the surface of bureaucracy, a repetition that implies persistence more than coincidence. The absence of closure in every file becomes its own form of continuity. Folklore takes root where the record fades. In Liberty and McIntosh counties, the WPA interviews of the 1930s document the story of the drum men of Darien. The elderly narrators speak in measured tones. They are not describing ghosts, but an ordinary phenomenon they have learned to avoid. When storms gather and the east wind rises, they say the ground begins to hum, as if an army is marching far below the mud. The interviewers note that each speaker insists the sound is real. One testimony recorded by fieldworker Lila Gray in 1936 describes a woman named Addie Lou who dreamt of her husband standing waist-deep in swamp water striking a drum that gave no sound. In the transcript, Addie Lou says that when she woke, the beat was still moving in my chest. Gray's note in the margin reads, "Subject trembling refuses to continue." The next page of the notebook is blank except for a pencil mark, possibly a signal to return later. Lila Gray never filed a continuation. Another field report from Reverend Silas Boyd in 1865, but rediscovered a century later, contains a variant of the same motif. Boyd records hearing freedmen speak of black soldiers who walked into the water and came out white as smoke. He interprets it as symbolic rebirth, the transformation from bondage to spirit. Later folklorists such as Henry Claxton interpret it differently as a syncretic echo of African ritual, the crossing between worlds through rhythm. The phrase crossing back through the drum appears in Claxton's margin notes. A third layer of folklore emerges through music. A wax cylinder recording made by Alan Lomax in 1936 contains a hymn titled "Where the Guns Lay Still." The lyrics, simple and repetitive, read, "They marched by night, they marched no more. Their drums are still beneath the shore. No origin is listed." The field note merely states sung by elderly male McIntosh County. Decades later, scholars comparing the melody find that its cadence matches the known marching tempo of the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops. The coexistence of fact and legend creates a double record, one of ink, one of sound. The bureaucratic file states, "absent, not heard from." The song insists, "we still hear them." The contrast forms a symmetry. The state declares silence, the people declare echo. Neither cancels the other. Each sustains a version of truth that the other cannot erase. The archive provides coordinates, the folklore provides continuity. A missionary diary from 1866 deepens this overlap. The author, unnamed but later attributed to a schoolteacher from Connecticut, writes, "One woman at evening prayer said she hears the boys keep time underfoot when rain comes steady." The diarist adds, "No sign of madness, tones solemn." This entry marks the first written acknowledgement of auditory folklore tied directly to a specific location. Its neutrality lends it more weight than belief. The diarist does not endorse the story. He simply refuses to dismiss it. By the 1870s, missing person lists and War Department files continue to mark several names as absent, not heard from. None are ever updated. The term becomes a bureaucratic euphemism for oblivion. In the same decade, a new chaplain visiting Darien reports that locals speak of drums in the earth. He attributes it to swamp gas echo and wind resonance. Yet he admits in his letter that striking the ground with his cane produced a hollow resonance. His assistant, Private William Larkin, later writes home, "We marched that road, and the sound came up beneath us, not around us." When Reconstruction ends, folklore becomes memory. By 1901, county surveyors attempting to drain the marsh note that machinery sinks inexplicably, the soil pulsing after rain. Church elders incorporate a funeral song called March of the Lost Men into their services for veterans. The refrain says, "They walked before the dawn, and the dawn forgot them." The transformation of tragedy into liturgy gives permanence to what the record excludes. The echo becomes ritual. In the early 20th century, scholars categorize these tales as folk persistence. To them, such stories are psychological residues of war trauma. Yet even as they rationalize, they preserve. Their footnotes repeat the words, drums, silence, march ground. Over time, the repetition forms a pattern as reliable as any document. Each attempt to disprove the legend merely recirculates its vocabulary, granting it endurance under the guise of skepticism. Thus the historical and the spiritual move side by side, the factual road and the remembered road. The archive remains cold factual, framed by ink and date. The oral memory remains warm, rhythmic, carried by voice. Between them lies a shared geography of uncertainty where evidence and echo intertwine. One is a statement of loss, the other a refusal to forget. Together they create what later researchers call a song of truths. The tension between the two records defines the case. Fact without memory is incomplete. Memory without record is unstable. Both rely on silence as the space where meaning settles. The field log ends with "at dawn silence." The old woman of Liberty County answers decades later, "No child, the drums just went inside the ground." Both sentences describe the same moment from different sides of time. In the discipline of history, these contradictions are usually treated as noise. Yet here the noise is the evidence. The accumulation of nearly 70 years of testimonies, bureaucratic, devotional, and vernacular, reveals a pattern of sound that survives without being audible. Each layer, whether fact or folklore, carries a rhythm, reports written like staccato commands, hymns sung in a slow march, witness statements trembling with repetition. The language itself keeps time. When viewed together, the documents and the stories form a continuous ledger of absence. Every official record ends in loss. Every oral account begins in continuation. The same silence that erases the soldiers in history preserves them in memory. Their disappearance becomes a perpetual event happening again each time the story is told. The drums of the vanished regiment may never be recovered, but their echo half-fact, half-belief remains the most consistent testimony the archive has left. The War Department report dated March 18, 1864, carries the final entry concerning the lost regiment. It reads, "No survivors were found." The handwriting is steady ink, darker than the rest of the page as if pressed harder by a weary hand. The next line was meant to record the recovery of equipment, but the ink bleeds and stops mid-word. Only one fragment survives returned. Beneath it, a thin penciled note by an unknown clerk, "Drums missing." Friedman's bureau correspondence from the same month echoes the language of finality. "Bodies buried without identification," one officer writes. Yet in the oral record, the phrasing reverses itself. A woman interviewed in 1937 says, "They say the ground wasn't done with them. The drums still answered that night." Her testimony does not contradict the report. It merely refuses to stop where the report ends. A fragment of an 1865 chaplain's letter states, "Their march was heard long after the smoke cleared." The letter is folded twice and torn at the corner, half the sentence gone. The remaining line reads, "And then there was light upon the river moving in time." The official counter-entry in the military summary lists no such event. Instead, it substitutes one word, silence. A later investigator, Sergeant Robert Keene, compiled casualty figures for the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops. His column lists "lost to swamp" beside 10 names. The phrase has no military meaning. It was crossed out by a superior and replaced with "presumed drowned." But Keene's own ledger, preserved separately, carries an annotation in the margin, "Locals report hearing cadence under mudflats." It ends there, a factual document bending toward folklore before cutting off. The Missionary Journal of 1866 introduces another dissonance. Its author claims to have visited the site with 3 parishioners. "We found no bones," he writes, "but the place hummed." His line spacing widens as the page continues, words spreading like the sound he describes. The final paragraph is water-damaged. Only scattered phrases remain. "Throbbing soil," "God's metronome," not to be spoken of again. An 1871 local court deposition contradicts the military absence with domestic persistence. A widow named Mary Etta Johns testifies she received 2 pay vouchers issued after her husband's reported death. She cannot explain how his signature appears on one of them dated 6 weeks after the unit's disappearance. The document was considered clerical error. The envelope enclosing it bears a faint stain shaped like a handprint. The 1880 Georgia Veteran Register contains an appendix titled "Unconfirmed Muster." It lists Company D under the heading "Partial Returns." The column for survivors is blank. The remarks section, typed decades later, adds, "Unit never officially dissolved. No order of disbandment exists." The bureaucratic structure holds the shape of men who are no longer there, an empty regiment preserved by habit of record-keeping. In the WPA collection, an elderly man named Elijah Miles offers the counterpoint. His voice is described as trembling but steady. He says, "My granddaddy told me the soldiers never left the march. They still go round that road. If you stand still, you can hear them." The interviewer's page stops suddenly. At the bottom, only a single line recorder interrupted by storm. The rest of the sheet is blank. The dual testimonies overlap like thin layers of tracing paper. In the official account, sound ceases. In the spoken one, it begins. The reports describe the absence of bodies. The songs describe their motion beneath the ground. The historian copies the silence. The singer repeats the rhythm. The tension builds unresolved between 2 languages that never translate each other. A field inspector's memorandum from 1873 includes a drawing of the marsh road. At the lower margin, he sketches 3 X marks and writes "possible burial sites." His later amendment contradicts the first "no graves found, soil unstable." But when the area was excavated in 1910 for roadwork, the foreman recorded wood fragments resembling drum hoops. The finding was never cataloged. The sample was misplaced within a month. The hymn "Where the Guns Lay Still" was transcribed by Alan Lomax 70 years after the battle. The field notes identify the singer as unnamed male aged about 80. After the 3rd verse, the cylinder ends abruptly with a clicking sound. Lomax's comment reads, "Recording failed. Unknown interference." The broken audio later becomes part of the mystery itself, the machine echoing the archival gaps that haunt the documents. An internal Army memorandum from 1894 notes that no graves corresponding to the lost unit were ever located. Directly beneath, another hand adds a corrective, however 17 unmarked plots exist near Savannah. The paragraph ends with the phrase "investigation deferred." It is unclear by whom or for what reason. No further entries appear in the file. The record repeats the silence it documents. The local folklore expands at the same pace that the archive contracts. Church members in Darien hold a yearly service for those who walked east and did not return. The 1928 church program contains the line, "The drums will answer when called." The same year, a historian reviewing military archives writes, "No credible evidence supports the notion of survivors." Two documents written within months of each other say the opposite without speaking directly. One museum label in the Savannah Historical Society reads, "Artifact origin, unknown piece of stretched animal hide circular." The catalog note suggests it might be part of a drum. Next to it lies a letter from a private collector claiming the item came from the Marsh Road east of Darien. Both artifacts and testimonies seem to point toward the same geography, the same silence reappearing as physical residue. A 1932 researcher, Harriet Winslow, attempted to map all known versions of the story. Her index lists 72 references labeled drum motif. Her field notes end on page 47 with a half-finished sentence, "All versions converge upon." The paper tears at that point. The remaining pages are missing. Her notebook was found years later in a trunk at her family home, the next page blank, except for the single word, "returned." Contradictions multiply. An Army surgeon's diary states, "Bodies recovered show signs of drowning." In another margin, the same surgeon writes, "None of the uniforms recovered were wet." Two truths occupying the same page, neither canceling the other. When the diary is catalogued in 1902, the archivist writes, "Condition incomplete, last 5 leaves missing." The pattern of absence repeats until absence becomes the only reliable data. The oral testimonies refuse closure. One interviewee in 1936 whispers, "They buried the men, but the men never stayed buried." When asked how she knows, she answers, "Because the rain keeps time." The interviewer labels this as metaphor unsubstantiated. The classification cannot undo the rhythm. The transcript ends mid-line, and when the thunder followed by a blank space. Even in songbooks, contradictions persist. A coastal hymn book printed in 1898 includes "The March of the Lost Men" without attribution. In 1905, a newer edition removes it entirely, replacing the page with the notation withdrawn. The publishing record explains nothing. The hymn itself survives an oral performance passed along without paper. The written world erases, the spoken one restores. In the official Army Chronicle compiled for the centennial in 1964, the event is reduced to a footnote. Detachment unaccounted for. Possible misplacement of records. In the same year, a radio interview with a Darien elder airs for 6 minutes before static overwhelms the tape. The last audible words, "They still walk. You just have to stand still enough to hear." The transcript of the broadcast notes interference cause unknown. The repetition continues through every medium ink voice sound decay. Each version contradicts the next, but repeats the same phrases, "missing silence return drum." The opposition between history and memory becomes its own rhythm, an alternating pattern of denial and echo. The archival lines declare conclusion. The oral ones insist continuation. Between them lies the constant refrain that neither can erase. In the end, no document or voice can close the gap. The final known report reads, "Investigation concluded." The last surviving song answers, "The drums will call again." 2 sentences facing each other across a century, neither disproving the other, both true within their own language. The silence between them is where the story still lives, repeating like a broken record, skipping on the word that remains returned. In the decades following the war, the region east of Darien changed hands repeatedly. Land once marked as military zone became reclaimed settlement district under Reconstruction policy. Freedmen families from Liberty and McIntosh counties resettled there, guided by Bureau surveyors using hastily drawn maps. One 1867 map recovered from the Library of Congress collection shows a faint hand-drawn outline labeled Old March Road impassable during flood. The notation appears in red pencil, its line running directly through the area where the lost regiment was last reported. Another set of documents from 1868 records migration patterns of freedmen moving inland after coastal soil exhaustion. The census takers note abandoned homesteads and fields where the ground trembles when stepped upon. They assume erosion or shifting water table, but their descriptions mirror the language of earlier folklore. The official account calls it subsidence. The oral account calls it memory. Both describe movement within the same soil. Testimonies from the Reconstruction courts include one from a freedman named Benjamin Small, dated April 1870. He swears he saw blue coats shining in the fog near the marsh while returning from market. The judge dismisses it as superstition. The transcript ends with a dry remark. Witness appears sincere but confused. His words, though filed as error, are preserved beside legal statements of property dispute. Two languages of ownership colliding land and story. A letter written by Private Josiah Bell, 2nd U.S. Colored Troops, survives in a collection at Howard University, dated March 9, 1864. It precedes the disappearance by 3 days. "We are marching toward Darien," he writes, "and they say the drums sound different here." His handwriting breaks midline ink smudged by water. The page after it is blank. Later, marginalia in another hand reads, "Recovered from flooded trunk, date uncertain." In contrast, an 1873 newspaper column from the Savannah Morning News reports sightings of colored veterans holding midnight services near the marsh. The reporter frames it as curiosity. They strike no drums but keep time with their feet. No photograph accompanies the article, but its tone wavers between observation and discomfort, as if unsure whether it records an act of devotion or of haunting. Folklore mirrors these entries in spirituals that began circulating in the same period. The song Deep River March appears in oral transcriptions collected between 1875 and 1880. Its refrain repeats "March on, but don't make a sound." In the index of the Fisk Jubilee Archives, the collector's note reads, "Origin uncertain, possibly Georgia." The lyrics describe soldiers who walked into water and did not turn back. Scholars classify it as coded remembrance, but among local singers it is performed as prayer. The Reconstruction mapmakers recorded boundaries. The singers redrew them in melody. Both preserved geography through pattern, one by ink, the other by rhythm. In the cartographic layer, rivers shift courses. In the musical layer, voices hold the same tempo generation after generation. One document lists lost roads. The hymn echoes, "Find the road that was lost." The reflection completes itself without design. The 1878 diary of missionary Clarissa Mott captures this intersection directly. "They gather by the marsh at night," she writes, "and hum a tune I cannot name." Mott believes it is Christian, yet the structure follows African call and response. She marks the melody in notation 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. Her conclusion reads, "Perhaps a work song." Decades later, ethnomusicologist Claxton will compare her measure to regimental march cadence and call it accidental continuity. Meanwhile, a veteran's letter to his sister preserved in the Boston Historical Society contains a confession rarely quoted. "I dream of them," he writes in 1879, "the men who went before us. They do not look dead, only waiting." His words belong to fact layer 2, a soldier's psychology, but the tone leans toward folklore 2, where dream and record are equal evidence. The archive does not separate them, the page contains both. By 1885, public memory begins to fade from newspapers but strengthens in sermons. A transcript from the New Hope Baptist Church in Darien records a pastor saying, "The Lord's army marches under the ground." He means resurrection, but his congregation answers with the line, "They still keep time." The stenographer includes it twice, believing it was repeated for emphasis. In the recording of faith, the echo becomes liturgy. The Reconstruction Bureau's later reports attempt to document religious gatherings, labeling them unorthodox worship. One observer notes participants stamping feet in rhythmic unison until the sound seems to come from beneath the floor. His handwriting tightens across the page, perhaps out of unease. The bureaucratic language collapses under the pressure of experience. The report ends with the phrase, "atmosphere heavy." Another bureau ledger lists payments to freedmen families whose husbands were missing during engagement near Darien. On the reverse, an accountant has doodled a small circle shaded dark, captioned "drum." The shape sits alone on the page, a gesture not meant for record, but for release. Folklore re-enters the ledger through the hand of the clerk himself, the boundary between witness and believer dissolving. In the early 20th century, the pattern of reflection deepens. Academic historians in Atlanta compile migration maps showing freedmen communities moving inland along routes identical to those traced by the vanished regiment. The path, once military, becomes domestic. On these same maps, folklorists annotate songs collected from those settlements. The coordinates align where the soldiers marched, the hymns survived. A field report from 1902 mentions settlers who plant by drum calendar. They measure seasons by rainfall patterns rather than almanac dates, saying the earth itself keeps rhythm. The surveyor attributes it to African retention, but the description reads like geography remembering sound. Fact and folklore mirror again, each explains the same phenomenon through a different vocabulary, soil movement, or ancestral cadence. Newspaper archives from 1911 document an unexplained vibration near the old road reported by farmers after a thunderstorm. The local editor writes, "No damage, only trembling ground." The same week, a church meeting records a new hymn. The ground remembers what the men forgot. No connection is made publicly, but the entries appear within days of each other, reflections passing between institutions, unaware they are sharing the same story. In the oral testimonies of the 1930s, dream visions recur with bureaucratic precision. Interviewees describe ancestors standing at attention in mist drums made of light. One man claims his father saw a whole regiment in the fog, but they were transparent. When asked where this took place, he answers, "Same road east of Darien." The interviewer labels it collective dream phenomenon. The transcript does not question whether dreams can be geography. A freedmen descendant named Ruth Palmer wrote to the Savannah Tribune in 1939, "My grandmother said they march every generation. When babies are born, they come quiet as if listening." Her letter never printed. The draft survives in the paper's back files. It rests beside an advertisement for military band instruments, a coincidence that ties commerce back to Echo. The unprinted letter and the unsold instruments are mirror images of memory unperformed. The 1941 Savannah State Folklore Symposium concludes with a remark by Dr. Henry Claxton. What the archive calls disappearance, the community calls persistence. His sentence appears next to a projection of the 1864 map showing Old March Road. Behind the lines of ink, audience members note hearing a recorded drum pattern played for demonstration. The hall vibrates slightly. A few attendees later report a low resonance beyond the speakers. In later years, local festivals commemorate the lost regiment with processions timed to thunder season. No official historian attends, yet their records cite the gatherings as cultural events of uncertain origin. Each procession begins with silence, then a slow beat. As the drums rise, older participants whisper the names of their ancestors. The sound reflects the absence, not filling it but tracing its outline. By mid-century, both versions, archival and spiritual, reach mutual recognition. The state marks the marsh as historic military site. The same year, church singers dedicate a hymn, "Freedom Lies Quiet, but the Drums Still Guide." The government installs a plaque that reads simply, "Site of Unresolved Engagement, 1864. The juxtaposition is perfect symmetry, bureaucracy declaring uncertainty, faith declaring certainty within the same ground. Fact and folklore now mirror each other completely. The map's red lines follow the rhythm of a song. The song's verses name the places on the map. The reports speak of silence. The hymns fill it with measured breath. The missing regiment becomes a lens through which truth and belief no longer oppose but reflect. One describes the wound, the other describes the echo. Together they construct a shape resembling memory itself, half history, half prayer, both still walking east. The record reaches its final threshold not in an archive but in the space where paper ends and silence begins. The last official entry for the vanished regiment appears in Record Group 94, Adjutant General's Office, page 247. It reads, "Status unresolved. Further correspondence unnecessary." The handwriting is faint, as if written by someone already certain nothing more would be said. The rest of the page is blank except for a single smudge, brown and circular, perhaps ink, perhaps something older. From that absence, the pattern of recurrence begins to surface. Each decade adds its own layer of echo, new reports, new testimonies, the same words. When the bureau letters end, the songs begin. When the songs fade, the festivals repeat their rhythm. It is not survival, but return. The historian calls it obsession, yet the community calls it answer. In the geography of memory, both definitions meet in the same field of silence. A 1952 oral history session at Savannah State records a speaker named Isaac Bell, great-grandson of one of the missing soldiers. He says, "My granddaddy told me the drums talk under the mud. You can't record it, only stand still." The tape stops for 8 seconds of static. The archivist's note, "Interruption wind." The transcript ends with Bell's last line written phonetically. "When the earth breathes, you know they near." A later historian reviewing the files identifies a pattern he cannot explain. Each archival loss corresponds with a resurgence of sound letters missing, when songs reappear, audio failures, when testimony intensifies. The more silence the record accumulates, the louder the echo outside it. He underlines a single phrase in his notes: "Absence is repetition." In the hook, the story began with a drum that never answered. Here at the edge of the investigation, the motif returns inverted. The silence itself begins to behave like sound, steady, patient, resonant. When field researchers place sensors in the marsh during a 1968 survey, they capture faint rhythmic vibrations during rainfall. The report attributes it to geological pressure. The locals smile and say that's just them keeping time. A weather log from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers notes an anomaly during storms. Low-frequency pulses travel through the wet soil east of Darien. The instruments register 3 beats, pause, then 2, an echo of the cadence found in missionary Clarissa Mott's 1878 diary. No explanation accompanies the data, only a technical remark, sound pattern consistent but non-replicable. The report was filed and forgotten. Reverend Amos Carter, preaching in 1972, delivers a sermon titled, "The March That Never Ended." He says freedom died twice, once in chains, once in silence. But the earth, it won't stay quiet. The transcript of his sermon appears in the local newspaper under the headline, "Old Pastor Speaks of Ghostly Regiment." His words are treated as folklore, yet the rhythm of his phrasing, 3 sentences a pause, mirrors the drumming pattern logged by the engineers. The motif spreads across generations like a recurring vibration. In 1980, school children in McIntosh County recite a poem during Black History Week. "We walk the road east of the river. We walk without sound." Their teacher, unaware of the legend, explains that the poem came from an old hymn. The documentation connects itself through memory disguised as education, the echo transformed into lesson. A journalist visiting the region in 1984 writes of standing on the marsh road at dusk. "The air is still," he reports, "but the ground feels alive." He includes one final line that the editor cuts from print. "It felt like something was breathing underfoot." The unpublished phrase, later recovered from his notebook, repeats word for word a sentence from an 1889 veteran's recollection. The language loops back on itself century to century as if dictated by the same unseen hand. During a centennial commemoration in 1986, a local historian attempts to read aloud the surviving military report. Halfway through, the microphone fails. The audience remains seated in quiet expectation. Someone begins tapping on the back of a pew, a soft, steady rhythm. Others join. No one speaks. The silence fills with measured tapping until the system resumes. The recording captures it 45 seconds of silence punctuated by low percussion. The archivist labels it audience interference. In 1994, the Army Center of Military History closes its final review of the Darien case. The conclusion reads, "Event unverified. Significance symbolic." The same month, the church congregation near the site holds a vigil, drums covered with cloth. At midnight, they lift the fabric and strike once. The sound fades into the wind, but microphones left in the marsh capture faint aftertones lasting several minutes. 3 beats, pause, 2. The report classifies them as wind patterns. Every record of conclusion becomes a preface for repetition. The investigation's end mirrors its beginning, paper silence met by human sound. No closure remains stable. The act of documenting the absence becomes another verse in the same long hymn. Each attempt to finalize the story creates another echo, another page where the ink thins into nothing. A folklorist visiting in 2001 interviews an elderly woman named Ruth Palmer. She says people keep looking for their bones, but the bones ain't the part that stayed. When asked what did she points to the mud road and whispers, "Listen." The transcript notes a period of ambient noise lasting 13 seconds. The researcher's annotation, indistinct rhythm 3/4 tempo. The files themselves begin to imitate the pattern of the drums. Letters missing, audio cut, pages torn, each gap positioned like a rest in a score. The silence arranges itself into structure, deliberate and recurring. The effect is musical, though no one admits it. The historians describe it as coincidence. The elders call it harmony. Both are right, though neither can prove it. At the 2009 Georgia Historical Conference, a scholar presents a paper titled "The Archive as Echo." He ends with a projection of the original field log, March 12, 1864, "Fate unknown." The screen flickers, and for an instant the audience sees the faint watermark of a drum behind the words. The projector light hums, then cuts out. The room remains dark. In that pause, the silence feels absolute. Afterward, the minutes of the conference record only a single comment, no further questions. The phrase repeats the wording of the 1864 report, an unintentional citation or a perfect echo. Somewhere in the audience, an attendee hums the opening line of "Where the Guns Lay Still." The recording device on the table picks up the vibration, low and steady. The archivist later notes ambient interference during discussion. Outside the hall, rain begins. It falls on the roof with an irregular pattern that settles slowly into rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 2. No one writes it down yet. Everyone hears it. The sound travels through the air, across streets, through open windows, back toward the marsh. By morning, the water will recede and the road east of Darien will look the same as it always has. Each document ends in silence, but the silence is never empty. It holds the shape of everything that came before it: the regiment, the songs, the missing lines, the unfinished testimonies. The absence becomes a language, the echo its only grammar. When read together, the gaps and the sounds form a dialogue older than paper. The archive listens back. The final oral fragment belongs to a voice recorded in 2012, anonymous, faint through static. Ain't no ghost story, it says, just a road that remembers. After that line, the tape runs for 10 more seconds of hiss before stopping. The transcript ends without punctuation. The archivist's last note reads, "No one wrote again, but the drums kept answering." And then nothing, only the sound that silence makes when it remembers its own echo. The rhythm still beneath the soil, steady, patient, unending. The first surviving materials that reassembled this story were cataloged not by soldiers, historians, or state archivists, but by accident. In 1919, archivist Edgar R. Wills of the National Archives found the field log of Captain L. M. Hensley misfiled within shipping receipts from the Georgia depot. The page bearing "Fate Unknown" had been folded into a requisition for salt pork. He preserved it without commentary, simply marking the folder "Recovered Incomplete." The log now resides in the National Archives under Record Group 94, Adjutant General's Office, Box 2, Folder 47. The handwriting remains legible, the meaning does not. Decades later, the charred drum hoop discovered near the marsh entered the Savannah Historical Society collection, where it was mislabeled, unknown artifact, possibly agricultural. The classification was corrected in 1978 after forensic comparison revealed traces of leather dye consistent with military use. The hoop remains on display, circular and hollow, without its skin, an object that represents both sound and its absence. A small plaque below it reads simply, "Recovered east of Darien, date uncertain." The Lomax cylinder recording of Where the Guns Lay Still is housed at the Library of Congress, American Folklife Collection Shelf, 8 Series B. The label, handwritten in pencil, is nearly illegible. The audio is faint, interrupted by static. In 2004, restoration specialists removed surface noise and found an additional 2 seconds of audible breathing before the singer begins. That breath, recorded unintentionally, has become its own artifact, a preserved hesitation between memory and sound. The WPA transcripts collected by Lila Gray were rediscovered in 1985 during a reorganization of the Federal Writers Project archives. Her final notebook, water-stained and incomplete, was found at the bottom of a locked cabinet. It contains 4 pages of typed text and several smudged pencil notes. The last entry ends mid-line. She said the ground still followed by nothing. The field folder includes Gray's identification card stamped "Closed Unaccounted." No further explanation accompanies it. When the Georgia Historical Review revisited the case in 1998, it titled the article "The Regiment Without an Ending." The author, Dr. Celia Bowman, wrote, "The difficulty of this record lies in its refusal to close." Her study compared military documents to oral history, concluding that the same silence appears in both official, deliberate, persistent. The silence, she wrote, behaves like a character. Subsequent attempts to resolve the question whether the regiment drowned, deserted, or was erased produced no conclusive evidence. The coastal erosion maps show no trace of a mass grave. No eyewitness report beyond rumor survives. The Army's final statement, issued in 2001, reads, "Event unverified. Further research not recommended." It is a sentence that imitates a seal, closing not the truth but the inquiry. What remains are fragments of continuity: the sound patterns recorded in the marsh soil, the recurring rhythm of the hymn, the oral testimonies that repeat phrases first spoken over a century earlier. Each piece exists separately, yet all mirror each other. The factual record ends with "No survivors were found." The oral record answers, "But the drums still answered that night." The repetition binds the story together not as contradiction but as echo. Modern archivists treat these parallels as symbolic rather than supernatural. They note that oral tradition often fills voids left by bureaucratic silence. but the pattern's precision still troubles them. Every generation rediscovers the same rhythm. Each investigation concludes with interference, missing pages, damaged audio, interrupted tape. Even in digital form, data loss occurs at identical timestamps. The coincidence remains unexplained. Today, the surviving documents are distributed across 4 institutions: the National Archives in Washington, the Savannah Historical Society, the Library of Congress, Folklife Collection, and the Georgia Historical Repository. Together, they form an incomplete chorus, each preserving a fragment, none capable of producing the full sound. When researchers attempt to cross-reference them, gaps align perfectly, as if absence were the intended architecture. A team from the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage conducted a comparative analysis in 2018. Their report concludes that cultural resonance continues independent of factual closure. The phrase, while academic, touches the core of what has lingered since 1864. Every silence repeats the first silence. Every echo shapes the next archive. The drums of Darien have become less a sound than a method of remembering rhythm as record-keeping. Local descendants continue to hold annual gatherings at the Marsh Road. There is no reenactment, no costumes, no official ceremony. Participants simply stand together at dusk. Some bring drums, others do not. After a few minutes, the beating stops, replaced by stillness. That silence is observed as both reverence and reply. They call it the answering hour. Nothing is recorded yet. The participants describe feeling a vibration in their feet when the wind shifts. The river, too, carries the memory. Its course has changed since the 19th century, yet near the site of the old crossing, silt forms circular ripples visible only at low tide. Locals say the pattern resembles a drumhead. Hydrologists call it natural eddying. The two explanations coexist without conflict, mirror and reflection of each other. Fact and folklore, each translating the other's silence. A copy of the burial register, once thought lost, was recovered from a private collection in 2020. 17 names remain unreadable, water-stained beyond restoration. At the bottom of the page, a single added line appears in different ink, laid to rest but not to sleep. The handwriting does not match any known officer. The forensic report cannot determine its age. The origin of the addition is unknown. Scholars now describe the case as a study in persistence. The event refuses conclusion, surviving through rhythm rather than record. Every attempt to impose order only reproduces the pattern, like tracing circles inside a drum. The silence becomes self-sustaining, its own archive of unanswered sound. Some call this failure. Others call it fidelity to truth's nature, which is to echo. The final document in the file is a memorandum from a 2019 curator, material condition stable. Content unresolved. Beneath it, handwritten in pencil, one word appears: listening. It is unclear who wrote it. The notation remains a quiet act of continuation disguised as inventory. When we return to the first line of the earliest field log, March 12, 1864, the colored regiment was sent east of the river, the geography itself feels different. The sentence that began as direction now reads as destination. The river that separated orders from echo, life from remembrance, becomes boundary and bridge at once. The men who marched beyond it have not returned yet. Their silence circles back like tidewater, repeating its shape. The motif from the Hook drums' river dream now converges. The drums remain absent, yet the earth still carries their pattern. The river remains silent, yet its current repeats their cadence. The dream that began as superstition now functions as preservation. Fact and faith mirror each other until neither can be distinguished from the other. The echo no longer answers, it endures. In the final assessment of the Georgia Historical Archive, the summary line reads, "No further data expected." The curator who typed it left a blank space afterward, as if anticipating reply. In that void, the story completes itself, not with discovery, but with reflection. The sound that began as report that lived as song that now exists as silence folds into one enduring refrain. The narrative once framed as disappearance becomes something else entirely. The soldiers did not vanish. They transformed into the rhythm that remembers them. Each page, each silence, each echo is their return. The history remains incomplete because completion would erase the sound. The unanswered call is the record. The silence is the evidence. The echo is the proof. Maybe they didn't disappear. Maybe we did. Because history does not lose people. It loses its ability to listen. The drums were never gone. Only our hearing was. And when the world grows quiet enough, when the air and the river align, The sound returns not as haunting, but as reminder that freedom, like memory, never dies. It only changes its volume.